The writer George Macdonald Fraser came face to face with the Border Reivers when he was writing film scripts in Hollywood.
Charlton Heston's grandmother, I think it was, is a Charlton, and he's very conscious of his border ancestry. And when you look at him, actually, there is a face that's straight from the Middle Marches, you know.
Today, I want to talk to you about guns. We are not a docile species, capable of coexisting within a perfect society under everlasting benevolent rule. We are what we are, egotistical, corruptible, vengeful, sometimes even a bit power mad.
God knows, when you think of the borderers who have made their name in, say, the 20th century, the first man on the moon is an Armstrong, which is not surprising.
It's said that the most difficult place to be recognized is in one's own hometown. And I consider this now my hometown.
And I'm told that the oldest man in space, believe it or not, he was 61, and his name is Story Musgrave. Two border names together. Oh no, they have spread a very long way. People like Richard Nixon, for example, a great family of Liddesdale. And there are many people who would say that Richard Nixon is himself an embodiment of the Reaver.
Last year, George came back to the borders. He and I were going on a journey to the turbulent 16th century. We set out to the bleak castle of Hermitage.
This is the height of the reaving season, actually, that we're in now. Because the beasts were fat after the summer, and the horses were fit after the summer, and the ground was hard. That was the big thing.
But they must have been a hard breed of men to be able to go hiking off across this lot.
You would think so, and I would say so. They, as hard a breed as there is in Europe, or anywhere, for that matter. I mean, when you consider that this is where they chose to live. And if you live here, how else do you live except by robbery? Until the great Anglo-Scottish Wars broke out, I suppose they were fairly quiet. But when the wars came between England and Scotland, the border people were the ones who suffered, because this is where the armies marched and met, and the inhabitants just had one hell of a time. Their earth was scorched, and they took to plundering for a living. It was the only way they could live. And they didn't regard it as a crime.
We should be seeing the castle soon, shouldn't that? There it is.
Aye.
Still there.
That's a bonny sight. I think it is probably the gloomiest spot in the border country. One of the early inhabitants was a gentleman called Solus, who was such an atrocious character that his associates eventually got fed up with him and took him up to the Nine-Stane rig and boiled him in a cauldron. Which is a way of expressing disapproval.
And he caused no further trouble.
He caused no further trouble.
Yes, a local worthy from Liddesdale described this place to me rather more bluntly than your description. He said it's the nearest thing you'll see to sod off in stone.
And he's dead right. He is dead right.
What sort of impression do you get of the poor bloody infantry who were manning this, you know, on a day like this in the 16th century?
They would think that this was great, I should think.
Compared to the hovels where they would normally live, I suppose.
All
comparative.
The blockhouses and the rough shelters can't have been any fun to live in. This would be civilization. And a trip into Carlisle, that would be big stuff.
A Saturday night out rattling up Rickergate in Carlisle.
That's right, or into Hoyk. No, I should think they were well content. They were free in a sense that I suppose we don't really understand nowadays.
But with 10,000 people living in a pretty barren valley, how did they feed themselves?
This is a good point, and the only conclusion I can come to is that they fed themselves off what they stole. I mean, the old story about it's legendary and probably true, about the border wife who, when supplies were running short and the men sat at the table, used to serve up a dish of spurs. Simply spurs on a plate, to remind them that it was time to get weaving. And out they would go and...
Replenish the larder.
Replenish the larder, yes.
Sir Walter Scott wove the Reavers into a romantic tapestry, embroidered with fair maidens and bold warriors. In fact, this narrow hill land between England and Scotland was for generations the haunt of outlaws and broken men who shook loose the border.
Most raiding appears to have been fairly spur of the moment. I mean, maybe thought about a day or two beforehand, and the word goes out to the boys, and they meet at a certain trysting place where they would cut symbols in the turf to show that this was the trysting place, and then off over the border or into the neighbouring dale, whichever they felt like. And they didn't confine themselves to stealing cattle. They stole also what they called insight. And some of the bills of complaint make pathetic reading, because insight consisted, among other things, of pots and pans and children's clothes. They would lift anything.
Anything that was movable.
Anything that was in the phrase of the border, there was nothing too hot or too heavy. You know, they would lift it. And old Wat of Harden, a Scot, he was, took part in the Kinmont raid, but he is alleged on one occasion to have ridden past a haystack and said, if you had 4 legs, you wouldn't have stand there lying.
Old Wat of Harden, a Reaver of Falstaffian proportions, was an ancestor of Sir Walter Scott, and a jolly old villain, who most likely would have described such theft as part of his inheritance. It was so deeply rooted in his tribal way of life. This was a frightened countryside, ruled by the lance and the sword. Whatever kings and queens in their wisdom may have decreed, the power in this land was the Reaver.
There was a time when this was the heart of the most lawless place in Britain. It was a place of murder and robbery, of cattle thieving and arson and blackmail.
It was called the Debatable Land. It wasn't very big, 10 miles from end to end, 4 miles across. But no rule of law ran here. The people of this place thumbed their noses at both the English and the Scottish crowns. And then, during the reign of Henry VIII, it was decided that this silliness had to stop. The debatable land had to be partitioned. Teams of commissioners were appointed, representing both England and Scotland. They couldn't agree. All they tried to do was pinch extra bits of land for their respective countries. Eventually, the French ambassador was appointed as arbitrator. He stood here in 1552, and in best Gallic tradition, he said, a straight line 3.5 miles in that direction. What he devised became this, the Scots Dyke, an earthwork that was opened amid celebrations on the 24th of September 1552. The Scots Dyke divided England and Scotland, but more important, it divided the debatable land. These badlands ran from the Scottish shore of the Solway up into the bleak landscapes of Liddesdale. The southern boundary was no more than 8 or 9 miles from the English Crown's most powerful border outpost, the castle at Carlisle. But the families whose names are still to be found in the graveyard at Arthurett, on the edge of the old debatable land, might just as well have been on the Khyber Pass, for all the control that the Carlisle garrison was able to exercise over them.
There's the old story told about the traveller coming to a Reaver community and saying, were there any Christians among them? And the reply was, no, we're all Elliots and Armstrongs. This, I suppose, is as near to being a Reavers church as any, because this was where my wife's ancestors used to collect blackmail. The business, as you know, of blackmail, which originated here, the protection racket. Pay us so much and we'll see that your goods are left alone. Don't pay us and see what happens. And Richie Graham, who had a tower over at Brackenhill, his minder and right-hand man was one Thomas the Merchant Hetherington. And he used to sit in the church porch with his account books, collecting the blackmail from the locals. What amused me very much was that my own father-in-law, after he'd retired, used to amuse himself by looking over the accounts of various farmers. His name was George Hetherington, and one of his clients was one Richie Graham.
So 400 years later,
yes.
We've come full circle. The story of the Reavers is a tale from the shadows of history. They didn't record their own passing. What documentary evidence survives is in the weary catalogue of dark deeds and official complaints that officers of the English and Scottish crowns dutifully prepared to explain why they'd yet again failed to civilise the borderlands. But the Reavers do survive with a remarkable vibrancy in the folk memory of the borders. When the people of Jedburgh gather each summer for their Callants Festival, they're remembering the way it was when the Reavers were in the saddle. As the Jeddart men ride out to the Reeds Wire, they're travelling to a day in the middle of the 16th century. The story they'll tell is one of conflict between England and Scotland. Scotland the brave and victorious, of course, as we're in Jedburgh. But the ghosts that they'll raise out at the Carter Bar, the men who really caused the bother, were the Reavers.
On
on that day in 1575, when on the 7th of July, the sooth to say, at the Reedswire the tryst was set. Our wardens they affixed the day, and as they promised, so they met. A warden meeting with the customary day of truce was held here on this bleak hillside at the Reedswire. Leading the English was Sir John Foster, warden of the English Middle Marches, who was reputedly one of the greatest rogues on the borders. Whilst for the Scots was Sir John Carmichael, the Scottish warden, who was a far more upright and honest man. And when Foster refused to hand over a notorious offender convicted of theft as demanded by the Scottish warden, some of the English attendants were incited to attack the Scots. As a result of this unexpected attack, the Scots fled. But on their homeward flight, they met the Jesuit men, who were on their way to the meeting. And the Jesuit men urged the Scots to turn back and fight again. This they did, and to such effect that the English were routed. And so it is right today that we gather here to celebrate and remember this day 422 years ago.
Christ came through the borderland, the beacons blaze on the Dungeon top, for the English knaves frae Cumberland, across the fell we girt our slap, near borderland which may not fear, poor borderland the foe comes near, stand firm and sure, forget our cheer, stand firm and sure, forget our cheer.
Riders like Baneprick and Nebulous Clem and Buggerback would be well acquainted with the concept of Jeddart justice, by which they were hanged first and tried later. It was just another routine hazard of making a Reaver's living.
And to fully understand what our ancestors had to endure and the toll of destruction wreaked upon them by the English raiders, just listen to this tale of destruction from July to the 17th of November as detailed in an official return in 1544. Towers, barnkins, parish churches, bastile houses, burnt and destroyed, 192. Scots slain, 403. Prisoners taken, 826. Cattle taken, 10,366. Sheep carried away, 12,492. Nags and geldings, 1,296. These families of Armstrongs, Elliots, Grahams, Rutherfords, Kerrs, Turnbulls and Douglases and many more kept the borderland virtually ungovernable. Now just imagine the surprise of many people now living in Canada or the USA or wherever when they discover that they're all descended from bandits.
Not so much surprised as delighted. Visitors to the border gathering are route hunting their way to Calaverock Castle in southwest Scotland.
We're in search of the Border Reiver. So many of you have Reaver ancestry. It's a thrilling story. I think perhaps, like other stories way in the past, we didn't want to admit what our ancestors did. But when it's 400 years ago, then you can start boasting about it.
I never heard the expression Reaven, and I learned it yesterday. And I think it's a bit history. In the underground, there is a Reaver alive.
Because that's where we sort of came from here. Yeah, we did. We came from here. Yep.
To me, this is living legend.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is living legend. It's the land of our antecedents.
I said I was going to come home to get my castle.
I think the name Graham, which
Graham.
Yeah. I think we're connected. Yeah, we just learned a lot more about that.
You're right in home territory here.
We're actually Irish, and we've traced our roots.
He is. I'm like the UN, actually. Almost every country in Western Europe, also Cherokee Indian and Micmac Indian, but I love them all. And I belong to all.
The Micmac Indians may be stretching a point, but the riding families are certainly well spread around the world. Banished first of all to Ireland, where the Grahams tried to disguise their reputation by spelling their name backwards. The Mahags are there still. But for many, Ireland was but a staging post on a longer journey to Australia or America. Billy Graham, Lyndon Johnson, Alexander Graham Bell, Kit Carson, all from reaving stock. This is the Reaver diaspora in action.
I curse their head and all the hairs of their head. I curse their face, their eyes, their mouth, their nose, their tongue, their teeth, their brow, their shoulders, their breast, their heart, their stomach, their back, their arms, their legs, their hands, their feet, and every part of their body, from the top of their head to the sole of their feet, before and behind, within and without.
I mean, this must be, I would think, looking out of the window here, this must be about the most blood-soaked spot in Britain. That frontier has a record of violence that I don't know, it makes the inner cities look kind of tame.
The cathedral was very much in the heart of all the mayhem, in a way. I mean, to be the Bishop of Carlisle, you had to be a fighting man. People like Harclay and John de Kirkby were quite notable that way. You know that I think it was the Bishop of Carlisle who crowned Queen Elizabeth, because they couldn't get anyone else to do it.
Well, because he was Bishop of Carlisle, he had the bottle to do it.
He had the bottle to do it, he just didn't care.
I mean, when you stand here, under this amazing ceiling,
yeah,
and think that while the service was going on in this building, within 3 miles of here, the riders would be out at Linstock nicking the cattle.
And the bishop was out in a great fury watching his cattle being nicked, too, by Hutch and Graham of Cargo.
I curse their wives, their bairns, their servants, participating with them in all their deeds. I put a blight on their corn, their cattle, their wool, their sheep, their horse, their swine, their geese, their hens, and all the livestock. I put a curse on their halls, their chambers, their kitchens, their standings, their barns, their ploughs, their harrows, and the goods and houses that is necessary for their sustenance and welfare.
The Archbishop of Glasgow's comprehensive curse on the Reavers. Today's Bishop of Carlisle, Ian Harland, no longer needs to be so splenetic a warrior priest, but he still has sympathy for his predecessors.
They would have had to make themselves a living out of the land and out of their cattle. The constant threat of violence from various different directions, the obligation on the bishop to defend a part of the frontier. The bishop's dyke isn't far away, and he would be responsible for raising a posse and defending that piece of territory. So I think life would have been fairly hard.
And every so often the heavies broke through and ransacked the place or burnt it.
Yes, and there's a lot of evidence of successive attacks on the castle over the centuries.
The Reavers once came here and threatened to kill the bishop's goldfish if he didn't pay up. He paid, and they killed the goldfish anyway. When Bishop Oglethorpe set off from here to brave the intrigues of the court and crown Queen Elizabeth, it must have been like going on his holidays by comparison with life at Rose Castle.
Oglethorpe's successor, John Best, there was a plot to kill him by one Hetherington in 1569, Now, those who know this area will realise that Hetherington is a Reaver name. It's made even more uncomfortable by the fact that my immediate neighbour at the farm, Rosecastle Farm, is Jack Hetherington. So I remind him now and again, let me hasten to say he's a very good neighbour, but I do remind him that the Bishops of Carlisle may have something against his forebears, just to keep these things in perspective, you know.
But you're not constantly looking over your shoulder wondering if the Hetheringtons are back.
No, and sadly I don't really know why he was under threat, but I presume that he had in some way offended the local power group at the time.
All the maledictions and curses that ever got worldly creatures since the beginning of the world to this hour, I lay upon them. The malediction of God that lit upon Lucifer and all his fellows, that struck them from high heaven to the deep hell, must light upon them. The fire and the sword that stopped Adam from the gates of paradise must stop them from their glory in heaven until they forbear and make amends.
The rich farmlands of Cumberland, with their fat cattle, were a constant target for the wild men of Liddesdale, the Debatable Land. In their turn, the families of Cumberland exacted what retribution they could.
Up the door, Laddiston, Lion of Liddesdale. Up the door, Laddiston, Crowther comes on. The Armstrongs are flying, their widows are crying. Castleton is burning and Oliver's gone. Up the door, Laddiston, high on the weather gleam. See how the Saxon plumes form on the sky. Yeoman and Carbineer, Billman and Halberdier. Fierce is the foray and far is the cry. Newcastle brandishes high his broad scimitar. Ridley is riding his fleet-footed grey. Headley and Howard there, Wandale and Windermere. Lock the door, Laddiston, hold them at bay. Little know you of the hearts that I have hidden here. Little know you of the Mostruthers' might. Lindop and Sorby through, Sundup and Milburn too. Gentle in manner and fierce in the fight.
Family fought family across and along the border. Scores were settled in single-handed combat or armed to the teeth reprisal raid. And overseeing it all, from castles such as the one at Carlisle, were the wardens of the marches. To them fell the task of trying to square the conflicting demands of local and national politics.
The English wardens particularly, more of their correspondence has survived. And it is one long complaint, one long bellyache. I can do nothing up here, I haven't got the men, I haven't got the money, I'm in dead trouble. There may be an invasion from Scotland any minute, and anyway, quite apart from that, the border is being broken every night by English and Scottish Reavers. I'm at my wit's end. Do something, you know. And they, of course, London never did anything. And these sorely tried men did their very best, and they did a pretty good job. Well, John Foster, he was extremely corrupt. He was the biggest crook on God's earth, but then many of them were. But I think his great claim to fame is that he had two of his troopers out on patrol in the Middlemarch, and they picked up a wandering character who was a dentist, of all things. He had dental instruments, but he was a foreigner. So they lifted him, they brought him in just for examination, and Foster went through his effects and discovered a mirror. And looking narrowly therein, as he put it, he discovered that in behind the glass there was a sheet of paper. It was a letter. And it contained the first mention of a thing called the Enterprise of England. And that, the Enterprise of England, was the sailing of the Spanish Armada. And this was the first intimation that there was in England that something like that was going to happen. And he naturally sent it down to Burley and Walsingham. And Walsingham mounted one of the most remarkable espionage operations ever, in which the headquarters of the Spanish Naval Command were infiltrated by a servant who got every detail, as Walsingham said, down to the last bag of lentils, of the armament, equipment, and all the rest of it of the Armada. And this the authorities had in London before the Armada sailed. It all started with old John.
In earlier times, the great, if not the good, were appointed as wardens. John of Gaunt, Richard of Gloucester, later Richard III. But by Elizabeth's reign, the job was being filled by another tough breed of specialist border fighter. John Foster saw at least 3 of his family murdered, but he lived to be more than 100. Old Scroop of Wensleydale wrote vitriolic letters to the court that would have seen any ordinary head parted from its body. And then there was Robert Kerry.
Kerry left the only real account, the sort of close quarter of account of Warden's work in his memoirs. He's very interesting about the border because he obviously had a kind of affection for the Reavers. He developed this. I mean, his account of how he used to go and try to lay ambushes for them, and how he would lie up in the terrace moss waiting for them. And he would wait there blue with cold, and then a message would reach him from them saying, hope the weather is keeping fine for you, we are somewhere else, you know. And he comes across as a very amiable, genial man with a great affection for the border country.
Who was playing the Reaving game?
Yes, yes. And he was well liked by the Reavers and respected by them. He also produced the only real testament that a Reaver has left behind. And that was a man called Geordie Byrne, a Middlemarch robber from Teviotdale. Kerry captured him. Byrne had so many crimes to his account that he was obviously going to be hanged next day. And Kerry visited him in disguise in a cell and talked to him and took a careful note of everything that Byrne said. And Byrne more or less told him his life story. And it's a remarkably frank and concise little document, all about Byrne confessed to, I think it was 7 great murders, and how he had lain with 40 men's wives, what in England, what in Scotland, and all the rest of the wicked things he'd done. And Kerry, as I say, took this down carefully, and it's the nearest thing we have to a Reaver actually talking across the centuries. And next day he was hanged.
Looking out from his tower at Narworth near Brampton, one day in the early part of the 16th century, another warden of the English West March, Thomas Dacre, was taking pride in the job. He just reported to the Privy Council that raiding parties had burned Annan and 33 villages, and that Liddesdale, Usedale and Teviotdale had been laid waste. His boast was that for every beast stolen by the Scots, his men were taking 100. There was a fine line between wardenry and reaving. The present master of Narworth, inheritor of the Dacre tradition, is Philip Howard.
So this was the business end of the whole place, was it?
Yeah, this was this was the main dungeon, and down here was a pit, which actually had spikes in, and you just fire your Scotsmen into there. But it was just one of quite a lot of dungeons. There was an entire wing with 6-7 dungeons in.
But you just left them in there to quietly expire?
Yeah,
so quietly expire?
No, well, we just found if they were worth anything. Now that was of course a different matter altogether. And we had a much nicer room upstairs where we would keep our prisoners for ransom if they were worth anything.
I noticed some holes in the ceiling which look as if they could perhaps have been rudimentary toilets in that day.
Oh yes, this is sort of good 16th century mod cons and everything. And yes, you know, the person who was upstairs, of course, was an altogether more important prisoner if you could ransom him. So yes, you know, he abluted down either into the pit or where you'd have other prisoners, perhaps just maybe Welshmen or something like that who you caught.
What a bloodthirsty lot you were. Dreadful people.
Where are?
Now, are there 16th century ghosts here?
Well, I felt something most peculiar in the Father Dacre Tower, and something came when I was revising my exams about septic tanks and things. I wasn't in the ghosty mood, and as I sat there, something came right the way through me and shot out through the window. The only thing I can think of, the fact that Howard indefinitely the Dacre wing of things above the Dacre dungeon, whether it was that or it was a Scotsman or a Robson trying to escape or something, I don't know.
No, if it had been a Robson, you wouldn't have survived.
You reckon?
Well, tell me about Dacre the Warden.
Thomas Dacre, he was warden from about 1509 to his death in 1525, but he was an extraordinary guy. Firstly, he married the Greystoke heiress, which was a fairly clever thing to do, as she owned all of Greystoke, Dacre, a lot of Yorkshire, Morpeth lands, and so it immediately sort of trebled the Dacre lands, which were huge anyway. And he had virtually a private correspondence with Wolsey. He was a sort of almost like a secret agent as well, and his correspondence, a lot of which is still in the British Museum and unread, is fascinating. There's wonderful stories of writing to Wolsey and saying, Cardinal, I have burnt 6 Scottish villages, I've got 300 cattle, 400 sheep, etc., 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 and little note back saying, well done, continue. And that again was the famous Red Bull of Dacre, which there was in Border Reivers times, I think the cry, a Dacre, a Reed Bull, would get fear into any Scotsman of the borders.
Thomas Dacre's son William also served as border warden, but with considerably less distinction.
This was Lord William's private library where he did all his scholastical works. He was a great antiquarian and everything. And through there was his chapel. But there was a great story in here where Lord William was working hard, and one of his captains of the guard sort of came up and said, Lord William, we've got a couple of Reavers. And he was busy doing his translations or whatever, and said, take them away and hang them. And you carried on writing as well. And then when you sort of finished, as you do, you said, I'm sure there were a couple of Reavers in here, where are those Reavers gone? And he sort of said, well, can I see these Reavers? Oh, we've hung them, my lord. Get 2 more.
And then presumably he would then come into his private chapel and confess his sins after that, if indeed it was a sin.
Surely it wasn't a sin to hang the old Scotsman, particularly when they were Armstrongs and such, who had been cattle thieving and the likes.
And would it be from this period that the priest hole would have been put in here into the chapel? Yeah,
the priest hole, Lord William's priest, who was Italian, whose name escapes me, it wasn't Tagliatelle, but it was something like that. He was the last man. His claim to fame was he was the last man in the kingdom who was racked. So whether he was obviously a longish priest, they would hide down there. And probably the most impressive thing is that picture on the wall, which was actually commissioned by Thomas Dacre in 1514 after the Battle of the Flodden, and it's got his own coat of arms, the Dacre and Vaux, de Moulton and Greystoke, of the flagellation, crucifixion and resurrection, which is an extraordinary painting.
My love built me a bonny bower, and clad it all with lily flower, a broad bower I ne'er did see, than my true love he built for me. There came a man by middle day, he spied his sport and went away. He brought the king at dead of night, who broke my bower and slew my knight. He slew my knight, Amy, say dear, He slew my knight and poined his gear. My servants all for life did flee, and left me in extremity.
The history of the Reavers is often written as if it was the history of Anglo-Scottish war, as if somehow the border riding families took to the saddle in defence of the overblown ambitions of their respective monarchs. In fact, reaving and war were entirely separate pastimes. But here at Flodden, near Coldstream, on the 9th of September 1513, the two came together in the most overwhelming military disaster in Scotland's history.
The English army is roughly where we are standing now, looking down into the little valley, and the Scottish army on the hill in front of us. But actually, the Scots should have expected to win because they had a larger army, and they foolishly abandoned their position on top of the ridge, and the fighting really, most of it, the worst of it, would be down where that hedgerow runs across our front. James IV, who was a very impetuous fighting man, led them down the hill. The English met them in the dip, and superior technology won the day because the English bill and the English halberd were far too good for the Scottish pikes. The Scottish spears, they just cut them in two, and much of the damage was done by the English riders under Lord Dacre from Cumberland.
There's an irony in that, because Dacre and the king were great pals.
They were great friends, and they'd played cards together, and Dacre usually won, as far as we know, at cards. They were good friends, and Dacre it was who actually was the first Englishman to reach the Scottish king's body, and he said the Scots never forgave him thereafter. Mind, they had plenty more that they didn't forgive him for as well.
More than 10,000 Scots died in the mud of Flodden Field for the loss of about 1,500 English soldiers. King Henry VIII may have thought that such a victory would secure his northern frontier, but when the battle was over, for the riding surnames it was business as usual. The Reavers on both sides reverted to type.
Hume's borderers took part on the Scottish side, Dacre's borderers on the English side, and afterwards both sets of Reavers, both the English and Scottish riders, plundered indiscriminately. Indeed, the Bishop of Durham complained that the English Reavers did more harm to the English army than the Scots had done, which is very probably true, because the borderers were looking after themselves. I mean, in a way, Anglo-Scottish war was an interruption, as far as they were concerned, of their way of life. And the community of the border still stayed terribly strong. One English commentator, I think it's Patton, describes how English and Scottish borderers would go into battle for their respective countries with their badges very lightly sewn on, so that they could tear them off at a moment's notice and join the other side if necessary.
But even in this place and time of misrule, there was a sort of rule of law on the borders. Occasionally the English and Scots wardens would meet for what they called days of truce at certain accepted places along the border. And this is one of the most famous of them, a great boulder called the Loch Mabenstein. It's about 300 yards from the high water mark of the Solway on the Scottish side. Originally it was called the Cloch Mabenstein, the stone where Mabon, whoever he may have been, was buried. There's some evidence to suggest it was perhaps part of a great stone circle. There's certainly another stone in the hedge just over there. And you have to imagine the scene. Across the Solway ford would ride the English warden with his retinue. Out of Scotland would come his Scottish equivalent, and they would eye each other up. They each knew the troublemakers on the other side. And then two of the English party, always the English party first, would ride forward and ask for a day of truce. If that pledge was given, they would ride back and tell their warden.
The same thing would happen from the Scottish side. Two people would ride forward and ask for a similar truce and ride back. Then gradually, the two great parties of armed men, and there could have been 40, 50, 60, 100 either side, would ride forward and meet by this stone. The English and the Scots warden would embrace. There would be a moment of silence. And then they would get down to business. Troublemakers would be identified, grievances would be laid, fines would be imposed. Whether or not they were ever paid is a different matter. For 4 centuries, this was the court of the border. But the laws of the marches were by no means a precise science, and the broken men of the border had their own more direct ways of settling old scores.
Is there a referee? Oh, there he is.
Next to swordplay, football was the Reavers' favourite contact sport. And when Hearts of Liddesdale meet Langham in the Saturday League, the same names are still on the team sheet. Langham has a Little and 3 Grahams, Liddesdale, a Scott, a Robson, a Graham, a Foster and an Elliot. No wonder the referee is keeping a low profile.
The 6 Armstrongs went across to play 6 men of Bewcastle on the English side, presumably at the invitation of the captain of Bewcastle, who was suspected of being in collusion with the Scottish Reavers anyway. And an English gentleman watching this match was disgusted at the thought of these Scottish thieves being on English ground. His name was Ridley, and he decided to organise an ambush to take the Armstrongs on their way home. Unfortunately for him, they'd brought 200 of the supporters with them.
Oh, nice shot.
And Ridley was killed in the ensuing pitched battle, and 2 of his friends. Various people were sore hurt, and one, it is said, his bowels came out but are sewed up again, which must have made him feel good.
So the final score was 3 dead that we know of?
3 dead that we know of, and many injured. But what the score in the match was has not survived.
Well, they had probably more pressing things to worry them than the final score.
But there was a football fracas in which King James had to intervene because Bothwell's nephew, young Francis Bothwell, Francis Hepburn, the King Devil as he was called, got into a tangle on the pitch with the Master of Marshall. And this, as far as I remember, he gave the Master of Marshall a sore fall, who retaliated with a stroke on Bothwell's leg. And they had to be separated, and they were due to fight it out to the death next day, but the King intervened. Football hooligans, 1590 odd. Well, might we see a bloodbath yet?
But for all the years of spilled blood in the debatable lands of the borders, there is one remarkable insight into the Reavers' code of honour: their treatment of women. They would blithely widow them, but never molest them.
An American feminist wrote to me and wanted details of rape in the borders. It had never occurred to me, actually, before, and I combed through and I couldn't find a single instance in the border papers of a rape being committed. And I think there is probably a very good reason for that. Obviously, I mean, they happen at local level and so on, but it was not a thing that a Reaver would lightly do to anyone he raided. For one thing, feud immediately, and that was one thing they liked to avoid if possible, because it would encompass the entire family.
And it got in the way of the business of good reaving.
And it got in the way, yes, and it caused dreadful trouble. I mean, the Maxwells and Johnsons very nearly wiped each other out. And their last great duffy at Dry Sands, you can get some idea of how seriously they took their feud when you consider that one of the Johnson riders was 11 years old.
If you want evidence that the concept of debatable lands is with us still, then come to this almost forgotten country road, halfway between Coldstream and Kirk Yetholm. The only indication that we're passing from one nation to another is the surveyor's mark on the road, and the fact that in Scotland, that way, they use a darker form of tar macadam than they do in England behind me. But at this point, the border divides. It's partially marked by a double-planted hedge, but it's also marked by this stream which runs in a culvert under my feet across the road. And between those two boundaries is no man's land. Since the 16th century, a piece of ground claimed by neither England nor Scotland. Neither England nor Scotland still. The Reavers, the hard men from the border families that describe themselves as riding surnames, have come a long way, from the debatable land of the 16th century to the electronic wastes of cyberspace.
Strength was the thing that counted. You would get an Armstrong with 7 or 8 sons. The interesting thing, of course, about them is their names, because quite frequently they called them by the same name. And you had to find a different way of distinguishing them. And the border nicknames are celebrated. Archie Fire the Braze, and Bangtail, and Stowlugs, and Buggerback, and most peculiar names. That always strikes me when I think of the patronising attitude which the South Country has to the North. It's all very bloody well for you, but those folk up there kept you safe, you know, and they did for a long time. I mean, this was the rock on which invasion broke time and again.
We're in the lands of the Grahams, at Kirkandrews-on-Esk, on the English side of the border and on the edge of the old debatable land. A church was built on this site in the early 17th century to celebrate the end of lawlessness. A peace church, the sacraments of which would wash away the sins of generations of border war and blood feud. At its door is a reminder of the days when sword rather than saint prevailed here. Across the River Esk is the main stronghold of the Grahams, Netherby, the mansion no longer owned by Sir James Graham and his family.
It's the most lovely hall. I had my birthday party here, my 21st birthday dance. It brings back enormous memories to me. And
you must regret the passing of those splendid days.
We do, enormously. But I think we were right to sell it when we did. And I'm just trying to remember the name of the Edinburgh architect who did this, who did it who was the Victorian, this is Victorian, and I can't remember what his name is. He was quite a famous architect. We had one other interesting king. Walter Scott was a great friend of our family's and used to come and stay here a lot. And he wrote the ballad Young Lochinvar, comes out of the west in the visitor's book as he was leaving on one stay. And that's a very famous poem, I think, now, isn't it? The Grahams, we started off as real border ruffians or border raiders, and we made our money really by running a protection racket, protecting other families, stealing their cattle and selling them. The peel towers were built by Richard Graham, a descendant of ours, who built 12 of them around about 1500, 1530, that sort of time, at a cost of about £100 each. And they were hard men, they were rough, they were completely ruthless. They killed you just like that. And they lived by their wits, and I would think rather like Chicago was in America.
So when did the Grahams turn respectable?
We turned respectable about just after Richard 1550, in the early 17th century, when again a descendant of our James, who was the youngest of a family of 6, I think, walked to London and managed to get into the court of King James. He became master of a horse to the Duke of Buckingham, made a considerable amount of money, bought the Neverby estate off the Cliffords, which is where we are now. He bought Norton Conyers in Yorkshire, Levins in Lancashire, and Nunnington near Preston. And he really is the cornerstone of what we have today.
Does the Graham character survive in the genes then?
Yes, I think it does. We're very resilient, and we have terrible downs, but we sometimes keep going. We somehow manage to keep going, you know.
Well, this weather's taking a turn for the worse.
It is. This is where they stored the cattle which they'd stolen. We've been told that there was a tunnel somewhere from here which went out under the River Esk and up into the cloakroom at Neverby. Neverby was a peel tower exactly like this. About 10 years ago, we had a coachload of Armstrongs who'd come from America, and we showed them the tower, and they were fascinated by this. And my father had a story, where I said earlier that we hadn't married an Armstrong, but originally we did. Some Grahams did marry an Armstrong, and that was fine until, as they came out of the church, the sons-in-law turned on their prospective father-in-law or mother-in-law and killed them with a dagger. This brought a shock of exclamation from the Armstrongs from America, and there's no record if it's true or not.
Now, reaving came in many and varied forms, and it went a long way beyond pinching the occasional sheep and cattle. They pinched the fish as well. The Grahams of the day decided to build a fish garth, a great curving stone dam across the river. You can still see the stones that remain from it in the water. What it was designed to do was to trap the salmon on their way upstream, thereby depriving the Grahams' Scottish neighbours of one of their staple foods. Now, you can imagine that would be the subject of quite a local controversy, but it became the subject of a national controversy as well. Just before the Battle of Flodden, King James of Scotland considered challenging the Earl of Surrey to single-handed combat. The prizes: number 1, the restoration of Berwick to Scotland, and number 2, the dismantling of the fish garth on the River Esk.
The fish garth may be gone now, and the Grahams may have had to sell their stately home, but they still have their estate. It looks out across the border to Scotland and the wild country of Liddesdale. This was a fearsome place in the 16th century, so lawless that it had its own warden, the keeper of Liddesdale, tucked up in his fortress at Hermitage. The one thing he couldn't keep was the peace. The Robsons, the Frasers, the Nixons, the Olivers, and particularly the Armstrongs saw to that.
The Armstrongs committed a depredation in England which infuriated the English Deputy Warden of the West March, Humphrey Musgrave. And he was a wild man. He was frightened of nobody. And he brought a troop of riders into the valley here and lifted old Simon of Mangerton out of his tower and got him back to Carlisle without losing a man, which was regarded as quite a feat. And presumably old Armstrong would answer for his crime, whatever it was, pay his fine. A year later, we have Humphrey Musgrave entering a prize horse of his at the Liddesdale races, just so that old Simon Armstrong could see it, with a view to buying it, which he did. And so here you have two people absolutely sworn enemies 1 year, and yet at the same time, when the business is passed, they're perfectly friendly and selling horses to each other. Old Simon of Mangerton is interesting. He was a leader who lived at this tower and who appears in a border bill at a Truce Day meeting, both as defendant and plaintiff, which is fairly unusual. As a defendant, he complains that the Hetheringtons, the Fosters and the Musgraves have despoiled him of £1,500 worth of goods, and as a defendant he is charged with murder, kidnapping and despoiling others of £400 worth of goods. So he was showing a loss on the year's working.
He had a bad year that year.
And mind you, it was academic because he didn't turn up at the Truce Day. So I don't suppose anything happened to him. I would say, in a way, this tower is the hub of Reaver territory, because the Mangerton Armstrongs were first among equals among the other Armstrong families.
Were the Armstrongs loyal Scots?
No. Sometimes. Like every border family, they were loyal when it suited them. In the big English incursion into Dumfriesshire in the 1540s, there were reckoned to be 1,000 Armstrongs as mercenaries on the English side.
So it was a sort of stately gavotte they were playing out here?
Yes. I mean, the odd thing is that it seems to cut right across this notion of border honour. And yet there's no doubt that border honour was there. They kept their word, a personal word given, which is not to say that they would keep faith as patriots. It's a very nice distinction, which they understood.
The Armstrongs had a sharp lesson in word keeping in the summer of 1530. Near this place, Carlin Rig, south of Hoyk, 32 Armstrongs, including their altogether too cocky outlaw-in-chief, Johnny of Gilnockie, met King James of Scotland, apparently having been promised safe passage. The king had them strung up, which quietened Liddesdale for a day or two, but in the long term poisoned the whole Armstrong family against the Scottish crown. Even with a family as powerful as the Armstrongs, there's much we don't know about them. Was Johnny of Gilnockie's headquarters the tower at Hollows near Canonby, or the great earthwork on a river promontory nearby? Little archaeology has been done, and researchers like John Cole still have to rely on the folklore of the borders.
In the ballad of Johnny of Gilnockie, John, just before he's dragged off to be strung up, says that if he'd lived a few years more, he'd have gilt Gilnockie round about. And it's quite interesting, it's the whiter sandstone that the tower's built of. When it's newly cut and the sun catches it, it shines like honey or butter in the sun. But that's hindsight.
What's your impression of the way life was here in the second half of the 16th century?
Well, if I'd been born to it, I might have got by, but it strikes me as a 20th century person as being pretty unremittingly horrible. I suppose once you got past the age of 4 or 5 as a child, the childhood ailments had let you get through that far, you stood a reasonable chance of making it to be about 18 or 20 before someone shot you, speared you, or hung you. You have this impression sometimes from reading about the Border Reivers that they were all leather-jacketed tearaways, and I suppose they were, but they tore away in a family. Could have hale and hearty senior citizens riding around, pillaging and looting, bringing the grandkids up in the way you're expected to behave. And if you didn't behave that way, there was frankly no future for you in this area. Because the debatable land is grotesquely, grossly overpopulated. Certainly the English side of it, well overpopulated, and it could never have survived without going out to bring in corn, cattle, and on occasion money, which they used to fortify these gains. But in order to keep the whip hand on the local neighbouring population, they had to recruit more people, and so it went on in a vicious circle. It's hard to see that it would have survived much beyond about 1600 anyway. The whole thing was top-heavy and rotten at the foundations. It was a society in decay.
As the old ways of the Borders approached their final decades of decay, the Armstrongs produced a man who was arguably the most famous Reaver of them all. Certainly the subject of the most daring border raid in which he was lifted one night from his imprisonment at Carlisle Castle. Alan and Phoebe Armstrong took me in search of Kinmont Willie.
It slipped down into the river, and in fact the local children have been poking around here from the school, and they've collected quite a number of skulls. The Armstrongs that are in here is amazing, the number of them.
Well, there's been some mayhem amongst these stones, hasn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, there's one there. That's an Armstrong there. It's a late one, it's 1855, that.
Well, what's this one?
This stone here, this one is in fact probably Kinmont Willie's grandson. The date is right. We know that this man actually fought in the Civil War, and his wife put the stone up to his memory after the Restoration.
Can you read that?
Sure. Here lies yen worthy person. Call it William Armstrong of Sark, who died February.
No, the. Have you got to the?
Died the 10th day of June. I've come round that side to see it.
Yes, it's June.
June. 1658. Aged about 66.
But at least he'd become an ain-worthy person by then.
He'd become an ain-worthy person. He was a royalist, of course. He was a royalist.
So where's the old timer?
The old timer's here somewhere, if we can find it again. It's many years ago now since we did, in fact, find it, and we were very puzzled about it. Phoebe was the one that actually found it. She'd probably show you what indeed happened here. But we were recording all these gravestones, and she was looking down here, and somewhere here, Phoebe, I think you saw, it's over here.
Yes. No, I was standing here.
You were standing here?
Watching somebody clean one of the stones, and it felt hard, and there was a little corner of cement. So we started cleaning, and lo and behold, what should appear but the saltire first, and then a hand, and then further along the long arm. It was marvellous finding it. We knew it was someone important, but not this important.
Wow.
That's it. Goodness gracious me.
We were really puzzled about this one for quite a long time.
Yes.
We came back several times, and then we did a certain amount of research, because what was puzzling us was that if you look, there's a saltire here, and there's a left hand stretching out as though it was showing allegiance to Scotland. We couldn't understand this with Willie, because really he didn't know much allegiance to Scotland or to England for that matter, but he lay more towards supporting the English. For the very reason, well, his grandfather was hung with Johnny Armstrong at Callan Rig. So he had no feelings of Scotland in that respect. And then we found some records that in the 1800s, late 1800s, a group of gentlemen had got together to restore this, and they had it recut. And it was sinking below the ground, and now of course it's sunk again. And they had it restored, and they were satisfied. And I'm satisfied from the period that certainly nears Willie's grave.
Give him his cover back.
Yep. Must protect it.
Oh, hey, you had o' the false account, hey, you had o' the Kinloch group, how they had seen Balkan Willie on Harrowby for to hang him up. They led him through the Little Rag and also through the Carlisle sands. They brought him into Carlisle Castle to be at my Lord Stroop's command. My hands are tied, my tongue is free, and why will dare this deed of vow? A ransom by the border law, a ransom to the Balkan blue.
An awful lot of damage has been done. They've been romanticised tremendously. And they weren't very romantic. They were bloody, wicked ruffians. I mean, in a sense, I feel that I did experience it in a way, in that I belonged to a section of the Border Regiment in Burma. And the Reaver, what can you call it? Spirit was very much in them. I mean, they were marvelous. I won't say marvelous soldiers, but they were marvelous men at war. And they would lift anything that came their way. Nothing personal, anything like that, but they were wonderful scroungers, and they were Cumbrian borderers. When you see them or are with them and see them in action, you get an idea of what their ancestors were like. But I remember going on an airdrop with them. We were being supplied by air, and all the units sent in teams to collect the rations. And that lot came out with enough to keep a battalion going for a year, tucked in their shirts, down their trousers, all the rest of it, you know. Nothing too hot or too heavy.
An agricultural show on an August afternoon. Look on a map of Liddesdale and you'll find this place called Newcastleton. Talk to anyone local and they'll call it by the name that Kinmont Willie or Jock of the Side would have called it, unchanged since the 16th century. Copshire Home.
The remarkable thing about this place, though, is the way that the same families have rooted themselves to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I remember as a boy at Carlisle Grammar School, the class that I was in, if you took that class roll and compared it with a bill, a Truce Day bill of the 1590s, I guarantee you would find half the names are the same. I mean, names like Routledge, Story, Bell. There were no Musgraves or Dacres any longer, but Armstrongs, Littles, Maxwells, Johnsons.
But the Dacres and the Musgraves would all be a private school.
If they were still around, yeah.
They would still be seeing themselves all right.
That's right.
Exactly the same way they did in the 16th century.
Another of the feared and troublesome families that's been here in force for the past 400 years, the Elliots, are now led by clan chief Margaret Elliot.
My father was in Burma.
Was he?
With the KOSB. Well, he was seconded with the King's Afton Rifles.
Yeah. They were a very tribal lot, still. and you could believe the Reavers.
Yes.
You know.
Well, you could see them.
Yeah.
Well, my cousin, who's the colonel of the KOSB at the moment, he says during the Gulf War, the jocks were they were fantastic.
Oh, they're quite useful.
He's very proud of them anyway.
Yeah.
I'm descended from a strong line of very strong, hard men. We have Wee Jock of the Park, who stabbed Bothwell. And then there's the Lion of Liddesdale in James Hogg's Lock the Door, Larriston. I mean, very romantic figures, not so much Wee Jock of the Park, who was, I think, rather fierce.
A thug.
A thug. Well, most of us. I mean, the clan slogan is "Who dare meddle with me?" And also my arms, I think you call it. What do you call that bit underneath? The
motto.
The motto. That's it exactly. Is "Fortiter et recti," which could be translated as "might is right." Could be. Which is a very, very thuggish motto, if ever you heard of one. Yes, but we were strong men. They were outlaws. But I think I'm biased. I'm on the Reavers side. They lived the sharp end of in a buffer state. Politics, armies going through. I mean, and then they became a bit of an embarrassment. And they had to be got rid of, actually. Pacified. I think, yes, I think they have had a bad press. Was it the first one blackmail came into? Was it blackmail? The word blackmail came
green mail was a term at the time used to describe agricultural rent. And blackmail was the rent that was taken at night.
It was protection money.
Protection money,
yes.
Yeah.
And also bereaved, wasn't it? That was another word that started from the Reavers. Yes, there was a lot of violence here.
The cockpit of the border war.
Yes, it was. But also it was very easy to hide cattle and hide things here. You could run over, just over there and be lost.
Yeah, but if you walk up the Taras Burn today, you can see how easy it would have been. You could hide armies up there.
Yeah, you can. In the fells of the hills.
Hear the wild welkin rend, while the Scots shouts ascend. Elliot of Larriston, Elliot, for I lock the door, Larriston, Lion of Liddesdale, lock the door, Larriston, powder comes on. The Armstrongs are flying, their windows are crying, the Castleton is burning, and Oliver's gone.
Travel north to the very limit of the Scottish marches, and folded into the hills near Moffat, which is almost 40 miles from the border, is the most famous of all the hiding places for stolen cattle, the Devil's Beef Tub. It gives an idea of the scale of the reaving and the distances the reavers covered. Travel east to Chillingham near Wooler, and you can find a herd of strange cattle that were here in the 16th century, but which the Reavers never managed to lift, which is still a matter of pride to their custodian, the Honourable Ian Bennett.
Well, the park was first built to enclose the wild cattle, because in those days, as you probably know, it was customary for both us and the Scots to round up all the young lads, and you went over to the other side of the border where you got hold of all the women and you got hold of all the cattle, and you took them back, whereupon you ate the cattle. They were a fundamentally important source of food in those early days, which was why the wall was built to contain them.
Oh, that's marvellous.
Now, for your benefit, if I ask you to get back in outside the vehicle, that means we've got rather less rather than more time.
Absolutely.
To do it.
Yep.
And because we've got the vehicle, we can take risks that we're not otherwise doing. And we're perfectly all right in the vehicle.
Yes.
But, I don't want to...
no, I understand.
There are no lilies in the greenhouse, so we don't want to have any. As you can hear, they can be quite talkative sometimes. I suspect that that darker animal is probably the king bull, the one that's making all the noise, and he is looking after his harem. There's another bull here issuing a challenge to him.
And seen off.
And seen off, yes. There's no way you can drive them. You try and drive them and they just scatter about to all the four corners of the compass. We have tried on one or two occasions and the result has been total chaos. You will read in your Buick Quadrupeds, for example, a wonderful description of a hunt which takes place, and there the entire neighbourhood turned out. And even then they were not always able to get the herd to move in the direction that was desired. So if the entire neighbourhood couldn't manage it, it was rather unlikely that a small band of Reavers would.
So they're a dead loss if you've got to try and take them back to Liddesdale or some such...
Yes, they were not good news as far as the Reavers were concerned.
It was rather wonderful to be surrounded by these wild cattle, because a lookout on the tower could see how many force was coming by the movement of the cattle. A force creeping in carefully would have the cattle looking sort of rather mysterious. A force coming over boldly would have the cattle frisking around and charging. So you could read the cattle pretty well from that point of view. So whether you were a sort of Scotchman coming along with the wind in your kilt, hoping to take this place by surprise, you'd find yourself out of luck. Or whether you were a Border Reiver hoping to drive cattle away, you'd find yourself out of luck.
Sir Humphrey Wakefield is the master of Chillingham Castle now, and is still much exercised by the dark deeds that his wife's ancestors were party to when the eminent Grey family held out in this place against the depredations of the Reavers.
There's a cage that you hang up in the battlement to put people in. They say, oh, how awful, how could you do that? Well, I mean, if a Border Reiver has come in and caught your younger brother out on a hunting expedition and taken him away, you go out and you catch a Border Reiver, catch one of them and bring him in. You say, well, in that cage you remain until we either swap you with my younger brother or my sister, whichever it might be, and or you tell us whatever you've got to tell us. But one can see that you would hoist that man up in the cage, and when he said, yes, okay, I'll get message through and you can swap me for your brother, or these are the guys who took him, you would let him out of the cage pretty quickly. But that's the way it was done.
It's perhaps not surprising in a pile like Chillingham that the past seeps out of the stones at you. It's supposed to be one of the most haunted places in Britain. And if you believe in that sort of thing, it's apparently just the place to see the 16th century in all its glory.
When I first came, I tried to get the place exorcised, and along came a priest, and he said, "I fear I can't touch it. It's too frightening, and they're too strong." Anyway, many other people saw Henry VIII and his whole court moving up this garden here. And so I often think that in the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1535, when the place was relieved by the royals, it could well have been that could have followed up with a whole wonderful courtier set coming up that garden. And I can imagine someone up here, where we're standing here, looking down at the gardens and saying, by God, isn't that the best sight ever, you know, and really sending out that vibe into the world. So if you're standing here on a still night, you just pick up that vibe and you go with it. Quite astonishing.
Perhaps not quite so astonishing is the fact that after Sir Walter Scott's colourful packaging of the Reavers, they've been consigned to a footnote of history. They haven't had the Braveheart treatment yet. But at Akewood Tower near Selkirk, the home of Lord and Lady Steele, The Reavers are remembered in an altogether healthier mix of romance and realism. The shooting, by the way, is of pheasants, not Elliots.
The location of the tower is also very significant because you've got the Ettrick down there and the burn down here, so it can only be approached really on a flat from the back, and there are no openings at the back on the ground level, so that it is semi-defensive. The actual location of it was well chosen. The romantic bit, I suppose, is that all these towers were built under the instruction of James V when he came of age in 1535, and he issued an edict that everybody in the border land who held land from the crown should build a tower against troublous times. I like that bit.
There was Reaver activity in Akewood, in this particular forest steading of Ettrick Forest, in the end of the 15th century, where there was a great sitting of the High Court of Justiciary in Selkirk, and practically every person, I think, who lived in the Ettrick Valley was brought before it on various charges of reaving. And there was one, Lawrence Rutherford of Akewood, was brought before the court with a whole list of crimes, including the theft of a scarlet waistcoat from a widow woman called Marion Bailey.
And although the popular version is that it was mostly cross-border, I suspect there was quite a lot of internal feuding as well.
The blood feud. It strikes me what we've got here, and to put the Reavers into some sort of context, we've got to understand that they were a frontier people.
Yes.
I mean, they were living in a buffer zone.
They were, and there are people living in buffer zones in much more recent times. I mean, think of the problems in the Sudetenland and the constant war as to which bits of Germany actually belong to Germany, which to Poland, which to Russia. More up to date, sadly, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and indeed all over Africa, where the boundaries tend to be those drawn by colonial map makers rather than natural ones, where there are still feuds going on to this day among peoples who inhabit both sides of borders. So borders tend to be, even today, debatable lands.
And when you see there is criticism on all sides of the Kurds, for example, who are caught up in one of these border disputes, and yet, in a way, many of the things they're doing, which can be looked on as reprehensible, are simply keeping body and soul together, keeping family together in a terribly troubled place, rather than the same as the Reaver in the 16th century.
Well, that's true. I mean, one would hope that mankind has learnt lessons, and that in the late 20th century we're no longer behaving as they did in the 16th century. But sadly, the actual lesson of history is that that's not so, and that people still are, in some parts of the world, behaving as badly or worse than they did here 500 years ago.
The Langham Common riding, with its jags of thistle held aloft, was first celebrated 150 years after the Reavers were pacified. But like so many of the border festivals, its spirit springs from resilient communities that find their origins in a breed of fighting men who, against all the odds of law and nations, made a life here.
Now, gentlemen, we again run our hill. So now I think it's right we had our fill of good strong punch. Twin Muckers had to sing because this day we had in a good thing. We've gone and run our hill, we think nae shame, because frae it our pits and flocks come hame. So now I will conclude and say nae mair. And give ye a please. I'll cry the Langham Fair.
The death of Queen Elizabeth was about to finish off the reaving years. Her successor, James I and VI, would unite the crowns of England and Scotland. But the Reavers had one last turn of the outlaws' cards. When the Queen died early in 1603, the riders celebrated by raiding the border from end to end. It was called Ill Week. It was bravado. By then, the seal was set. The inevitability of it all might have been denied by moonlight, but in the cold light of day, the majority of borderers, in places like Redesdale, that had lived on a knife edge for more than 100 years, understandably, were prepared to give the rule of law a chance.
It took its share of hammering, yes. One of the two great Reavers' nests on the English side, Redesdale and over the hill Tynedale. Tynedale being the worst of the two, since it had the Robsons among us, and the Milburns and the Charltons. But Redesdale, Milburns here, and Halls and Duns and Potts and Headleys, and it must have taken a good thumping. It's bang in the middle of the English Middlemarch. I should think it saw a great deal of damage, as you can tell from the strength with which they built it. They weren't doing that to keep out the rain, you know.
That and the fact that there's a whole community, a village settlement clustered around this fortified house here.
And it's well sighted too. You get lots of warning of what's coming from the north. And I would hate to think how often it took raids. I would have said Redesdale would see one a week anyway in the reaving season, possibly more. And I mean, you get the case of a place like Killam over in the East March, which took 3 raids in one night from the same people, one after another. They came in, they hit it, they went out and were pursued, got annoyed at being pursued, came back and raided a second time, and then when the inhabitants presumably thought that was it, they were back again at dawn. And I don't suppose there was much left in Killam. And one can only take Bishop Leslie's word for it, and that they were extremely good, A, at finding their way in the dark, and B, at eluding pursuit.
They knew the ground.
They knew the ground, and they knew it well. And you get a hobby noble or a black Ormiston, he could probably find his way through this in the dark. No trouble at all. After all, it was what they did from childhood.
Throughout the borders, families had to come to terms with a strange new way of life. They changed their line of business. Relatives of the Dewar Pringles of Smailholm Tower went into the knitwear trade. The Charltons and the Robsons took to skirmishing on the football field, and perhaps most appropriate of all, the Armstrongs became imperial gunmakers. Apart from what's left of their towers, very few artefacts of the Reaver remain. They were poor people. They came from a fractured society. Ironically, the Romans have left more evidence of their stay than the Reavers have. But if you want to capture the spirit of the Reavers, you can at least follow the tracks they took on their nighttime raids. This is part of something called the Thief's Road. It begins in northern Dumfriesshire and travels for 40 miles across Summit and through winding hidden valleys all the way to Hermitage and Liddesdale. And this is the way they would come back with their haul of black cattle, and echoing from the hills would be the sound of the hounds. The trod was enshrined in law, a hot trod if done immediately, a cold trod if done within 6 days of the raid. Sir Walter Scott called it the fatal privilege. You can imagine it. Pursuer would meet pursued. In a valley like this one, there'd be the clash of steel, and a Reaver would be left bleeding by the burn, perhaps the start of another bitter blood feud. There were many losers and some notable winners in the feuding business. The Kerrs of Cessford were particularly partial to feuding. At one time or another in the 16th century, they were in brutal conflict with up to 7 border families, and that's not counting another branch of the Kerrs. Even so, they were eventually able to abandon their crumbling castle at Cessford, and as Dukes of Roxburgh, hold sway in the largest inhabited house in Scotland, Fleur's Castle at Kelso. Among the Kerr's regular feuding rivals were the Scots of Buccleuch, the same family that bred the bold Buccleuch who lifted Kinmont Willie out of Carlisle Castle. The present Duke of Buccleuch is one of the biggest landowners in Britain, with estates in Northamptonshire, Dumfriesshire, and still in the Borders.
I think basically my family was motivated by the need for some sort of collective security, which is why they went on enlarging their estates and buying more and more land in order to try and have a secure base from which to operate. While you had a debatable land occupied by people who were outside the law of any country, that was really the cause of the trouble. And I think that Buccleuch, amongst others, realised that if you did away with this rather artificial little in-between state, filled with terrible, wicked men, you might then make some progress. And I think this is what happened. I think there was a fair amount of peace thereafter.
I suppose history judges the Reavers as thugs. Do you take any rather kinder view of them than that?
I suppose that if you lived at that time, it was something which you just accepted. The other chaps came and grabbed all your cattle and sheep, and you had to go and get them back. And in the course of getting them back, you probably got a few extras. And so it went on. And then, of course, the Douglases of Drumlanrig, they came into the picture very much too, as people who were warden of the marches and trying to sort of keep their finger on the safety valve.
Drumlanrig is the Dumfriesshire estate of the Duke of Buccleuch and Queensberry. It came to the family through marriage with the Douglases. Administrator Drew Fisher's researches have shown that, like most successful border families who played both kingdoms against the middle, the Douglases brought with them a considerable amount of Reaver baggage.
They lived in a period of kill or be killed, of course, and they were adept at striking the first blow, certainly. Sir James himself, although a very perfect knight, to use the expression, was quite capable of the utmost barbarity. For example, when he captured his own castle of Douglas back from the English, he killed all the animals inside the castle, killed all the garrison, threw their bodies into the well, covered them with flour and wine, and set the whole lot on fire, and that is the Douglas larder, as it's known to Scots. But they were a ruthless breed because their enemies were the same.
When the families were reaving and fighting their way across this landscape in the 16th century, were they demonstrating something of the same characters that James Douglas had demonstrated?
Oh, I think undoubtedly, yes. This kill or be kill was very evident in the 16th century, and they showed this ability to pick the right side straight through into the great days of 1707.
Most histories of Britain ignore the Border Reivers, and why should they not? Apart from a few notable exceptions, they were just ordinary people who lived by the standards of their time. But the Reaver families have endured in their tribal lands in a quite remarkable way. Some evening in the reaving season, drive up into Liddesdale when they're having their music festival and look at the faces. And if you're an Armstrong or an Elliot or a Robson, come to that, look at yourself in the mirror.
James I was the only monarch who really took the border seriously. And hence, when he came to the throne, one of the first things he did was to abolish the border and say that the place must now be called Reavers. And England and Scotland, he hoped, would cease to exist, and this would be called the Middle Shires. And he pacified the border, certainly, very brutally. But most of the Reavers were either shipped to Ireland or enlisted in the Low Countries. And all was quiet, all of a sudden. It took about 10 years to pacify the border after Queen Elizabeth died. And after that, it was as though it had never been.